That's not my board. Yeah. Is that okay with you guys?
100%. So.
Well, there you go. It's a win-win.
I have a few quiz questions. But I'll follow whatever you're. Cool. Only thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you may know give us some changes.
Yeah. But she's talking about more silver. Right. So you're gonna do some of that.
So she's asked me like, can you do for this? You know, it's only a second one. She's like, can you just do what you need to do for the come and help me? It's interesting.
Okay. Yeah, I'll cut you loose. You can slip out the back door, so it's just on, you know.
All right, I mean, I'll apologize.
So where do you want to call? I put my bag here. Do you have any specific?
No, as long as you're seated here and you have access to a microphone.
Anything more? We'll talk.
We don't have, well, here's one here. So how was your trip out?
I was just coming out here, yeah. I'm showing the story specifically. Very important one of those plays. It's the last time I did a nice Zoom display. Like the last sentence. It's a real group of kids.
Right, the only one. So you were pretty busy.
Yeah, I was in
Well, yeah, I just gotta say,
I don my robes and I'm but also
Now, well, it's a.
What were their nationalities?
It's Atria. Yeah. Yeah, so I have to finish it.
And then there's those of us who are free owners.
Thank you. Yeah, it's one of those things where
So for some people,
Break in and say that real quick. Good to see you. We'll catch up later, okay?
So, you know, we also have
It's barely me. I've been talking for like years. Well, pretty much everybody on this panel, Brad and I were that way, that way too. We were emailing long before. Yeah, the next one. Oh, right, obviously. I don't know. Surely has spoken about I have a very rough notes of biography of Priscilla Hugo that will probably be years away. Unless somebody beats me to it, in which case I'll pass them on.
That's really Did you have to lobby to get her results?
I think I knew some of that. I think it wasn't her that I talked about. She was something
original
she bounced around a lot of places. Part of the reason that she was American community lost track of her. She kept getting some funny people, and then she moved in with her. Yeah.
Hey, good to see you.
Because that
Wow.
my reporting, now it's kind of run down.
Right.
You see like background.
most of them are, really
It's kind of like walking in one day, it was just like, the front door was open, I was like, well, let's just go in. So.
Remind me to follow that thread.
Yeah,
Those
yeah,
pilgrimages.
yeah. I'll write it down. I have a list of things I need to, people need to email.
Okay, see you guys.
Amongst the
I think you're running a little late.
Well,
I think you're ready to start. I mean, we're supposed to starting at what time?
yeah, no.
Okay.
So I guess we have a quorum.
Do we have a mic for this side?
Well, welcome to our panel on.
We can move, yeah, we'll move.
Welcome to our panel on authors and the incarceration. I'm Ray Locker. I'm an editorial consultant to the foundation. I have the pleasure of working with all these folks in various ways as we tell this fascinating story. So I'm going to get out of the way and basically kick it off to everybody here, but I'm going to introduce them first. Duncan Williams from USC, a Buddhist priest and author of the new book American Sutra, which talks about the Buddhist experience during incarceration. Shirley Ann Higuchi, who you all know as chair of the Hard Mountain Wyoming Foundation. She has a book coming out next fall or next spring tentatively called Setsuko's Secret, the story of an American concentration camp. It is about her family's experience here at Hard Mountain, and it traces them and other people from Hard Mountain throughout the war into the present day. With Andrea Warren, whose new book Enemy Child is about Norman Mineta, which we heard about in the morning session, and Bradford Pearson, who is writing a book about the Hard Mountain Eagles football team, which had a tremendous run of success during its 2 seasons at Hard Mountain. So what I'd like to do is starting with Duncan first, for the authors to say how they came about deciding to write this book about the Japanese-American incarceration experience, because everybody has a different background, they're all coming at it from a different place.
And I think this is, hello? I don't think this is turned on.
maybe up.
Yeah.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so my name is Duncan Dukin Williams, and as Rick has said, I'm the author of this book that's called American Sutra. You know, I was born in Tokyo, Japan. My mom's Japanese, my dad's British, so I don't have any family history or connection to the wartime Japanese-American experience. It was only when I was just about finished with grad school and I got this news that my dissertation advisor, Masatoshi Nagatomi, who's a professor of Buddhist studies at Harvard, had passed away, and that his wife asked me to help clean out his office and see if I could take anything that was written in Japanese and kind of put it aside so that his great collection of books in Buddhist studies could be gifted to the library. And so as I was doing that, one of the things that came out was something written in Japanese with that family name, Nagatomi, on it. But then I realized the handwriting looked a little bit different than my professor's. And as I started reading it, it turned out it was written by his father, Reverend Shinjo Nagatomi. I would come to learn he was the Buddhist priest who, in Manzanar, you know that Ireto, that kind of white monument? It says Ireto, the 3 characters. He's the one that wrote those characters. Okay? And what I had in my hands was his wartime in Manzanar diary of what he did as a Buddhist priest there, how he helped to build the Ireto, how he did all these things around Obon inside camp. But as I said, I wasn't familiar with this story, and when the family asked me, could you translate this diary for us? I was like, of course, out of respect, I'm happy to do it. My first language is Japanese, and I think I can do it. But then there'd be words like mess hall. and I was like, what is that? So I had to kind of take a crash course in self-educating myself about this thing. Anyway, this book took me 17 some years to write, 120 or so oral histories, archival research at the National Archives of Buddhist temples, Once I did that diary, I got contacted by many other Buddhist families who had fathers who were in the DOJ camps, in the WRA camps, who had diaries. And so I started translating diaries as the basis. And so I tried to do a book that was kind of about the inside out of what did Buddhists experience in this World War II Japanese-American history. And yeah, I'll talk more about that maybe later. But that's how I got started. I stumbled upon this diary, and I had to kind of like learn about this.
Thank you very much, Duncan. Also, his book will be available in the gift shop for signing, as well as Enemy Child that we'll hear about shortly. My name is Shirley Higuchi, and I am chair of the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation. And the premise for my book, and it's really been a work in progress probably since 2005, 2006, and it's changed and shifted, but what it's really kind of evolved into is something similar to a memoir, focusing on about 8 to 10 families in the beginning of the 1900s when the Issei's immigrated to the United States, and following these 8 families throughout their entire lifetime. And what's really interesting about this, in addition to my own parents and tracing their lives and their successes, we also trace Norman Etta's life and Al Simpson's life and the intersection. And essentially it's sort of, the crescendo is the grand opening in 2011 of our magnificent museum, which you'll see tomorrow. But what's really ironic about, there's like 6 degrees of Heart Mountain separation. These characters have really intersected together probably for the last 75, 80 years. If you think with Norm and Al being kids meeting, and the fact that my parents met there, the interesting relationships and how those relationships evolved really stands out. But the opening scene of the book really starts on my mother's deathbed. For those of you that know her, she passed away of pancreatic cancer in 2005. And essentially when we went to her bedside as she was dying, we asked her, where do you want your coda, your memorial to go to? And she whispered, Heart Mountain. And we were all shocked with that response because she was very quiet about her experience in the incarceration. But after she died, I actually got to understand and know her through the many Nisei's and board members that had worked with her prior to her death. So apparently she had anonymously donated money back to Wyoming to dream of something being built here in Wyoming. And of course we reached that dream in 2011, but she wasn't here to see it. So it's sort of an interesting journey, part memoir, part historical caption of the characters, and it really sort of gives the audience a full perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, Shirley. Well, I'm a children's book author, a nonfiction children's book author, which is kind of an odd little category of writing for children. It's growing, but I've been at this now for 20 years, so I have 9 books out in this category. And what I'm always looking for, the stories that I write, is that of a very resilient child who's been up against something that is of historic significance, and that has put this child through an experience that kids really shouldn't have to go through. And then there has to be something, some sort of redemption that comes with this. So not only does the child meet this challenge, but goes on to do something with it. So I've written books about, a couple of books about the orphan trains, but have always picked the people I've written about who become active, started the orphan train movement, for example, got involved in orphan train history, that sort of thing. So you can see that with each one of the books that I do. I didn't know I was sort of pegging it that closely, but after about 4 books it became real obvious that that's what I was doing. So I've just always been very drawn to these real stories of resilient children. So there's that part. And I was in Cody, Wyoming 5 years ago, finishing up research for my previous book, which is called The Boy Who Became Buffalo Bill. I'm from Kansas City, and a lot of the Civil War played out there early before the actual fighting began, as we know it as the Civil War. And so I was in Cody working in the archives at the museum, and I saw an announcement for the opening of an interpretive center at the Heart Mountain War Relocation Center. Now, again, 5 years ago. So I had to think for a minute. A War Relocation Center? Oh, that's what they called the internment camps during World War II. But I had never studied them. I'd read Snow Falling on Cedars. You know, I had a little bit of background in that respect, and that was pretty much it. So the friend who was traveling with me, who actually happens to be traveling with me again today, back to Cody, sort of recreating some of our trip here 5 years ago, decided to come out and see what this was all about. And we got to Heart Mountain at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The Interpretive Center was closing at 5. So we did sort of a quick tour through, and I still remember being stopped by this one display that was talking about Norm Mineta and his friendship with Alan Simpson. Now, as a writer, and a writer who writes for kids 10 on up through adult, but really focusing on that upper elementary, middle school, high school, and I read about the friendship that started all those years earlier and then into the halls of Congress. You know, your heart just goes like that as a writer. It's like, here's a story, because of that beautiful arc to it. But that's all I knew at that point. I mean, there was going to be so much more that I would learn. We went out and walked the grounds that day after the Interpretive Center closed, and I like everybody I think I've talked to who's ever first seen that plane where the camp was, and seeing Heart Mountain itself, you know, just hard, you're just almost overwhelmed with what happened there. So having come up through the school of journalism and been a journalist for many years, you know, you just start doing the hard research and wanting to know more and starting to question. And at that point, I did commit myself to writing a book about it. I was finishing up with the other book, and I was hoping Norman Mineta might come aboard. I didn't know how to get in touch with him. It doesn't help to try to find him on the internet. He's not there, not his personal information. And so I just started contacting any kind of organization that had to do with Japanese Americans. The question would come, why you? You're not Japanese American, you were born after the war. I mean, I'm used to those questions. I've written about Holocaust survivors and so forth, and it's because I'm a journalist, because I see it through those eyes, through the trained eyes, because I know how to do the research. And so finally, one person said, well, I think this is a good idea, and here's the phone number. And so I made that call. I talked to Norm's assistant, told her what I was interested in doing, and she said that she would talk to him and get back to me. I said what I'd like to do is write him a letter and send him copies of several of my books. She did get back to me. He said he would like to see those, and the letter was fine, so I mailed all that off. And a couple weeks later, it was probably 3 or 4 weeks later, the assistant called me again and said he'd like to speak to you. So we got on the phone and we talked for quite a while. And by the time that phone call was over, we were looking at our calendars to find a time when I could travel from my home to his home and spend several days with him. And he was, at the same time, he'd been working with Deborah and Diane. He told me that, you know, he said no for years and years and years to any kind of a project that he considered commercial, because he never ever wanted to benefit personally from this in any way. But here are these two brilliant Japanese American filmmakers, and here's this children's book author who's going to get it into the hands of young people, and that's what he wanted. So he said okay. And I had a little bit of trouble placing this with a publisher, simply because they're like, well, is anybody really going to be interested in that story? You know, I mean, that's always kind of the first reaction you hit, until the proposal went to an editor at Holiday House who grew up in Central California, and through that whole silent period after the war, when she had Japanese American classmates, but nobody was talking. She knew something had happened and didn't know what. And then here comes my proposal. So she was on board and has stayed on board. And so the result is indeed Enemy Child. It came out in April. And one last thing, if you are interested in getting an autograph from Norm, we've got a session at 7 tonight, and he will be there.
Thanks, Andy. My story, I'm Brent Pearson. My story is actually pretty similar to Andy's, in that 5 years ago, I was in town working on a story about Yellowstone, and Claudia Wade took us on a tour to the Interpretive Center, and I knew next to nothing. I grew up in New York, and I think that from a World War II history standpoint, you learn very little. about Japanese American incarceration. Even if you're in AP US history, you probably spend one class on it. And then when I was at the Interpretive Center, there's one sentence at the very end of one of the displays that says Heart Mountain High School also had a high school football that I thought would today has sort of changed my entire life and brought this story to a lot of people that I hope will read it once I finish writing it. So, which will hopefully, I have to turn it in December, so. But
Do you have,
that's my
so
dream.
you have a publisher and it's all set?
Yeah, I have a contract and
Perfect.
my manuscript's due in December, so.
With Simon and Schuster.
Oh, wow.
You've all mentioned using primary sources and documents to help you. Can each of you explain what you think was the most unique or telling document or artifact that you found as you went about working on this story? And I'll start with Shirley.
Well, unique story, unique artifact. I think probably the most interesting aspect was, and I encourage all internees, families to do this, is pulling the war relocation files, the actual files on your parents. And, you know, the Nisei, the quiet Americans, didn't really talk much about what happened to them in the prison camp. And so by opening up the archive, you have the ability to really experience what they were actually experiencing. So I think kind of learning about some of the things that were going on, one is it really struck me, it was kind of strange that the staff, the camp counselors are doing actually psychological profiles on the children, and actually within that system sort of categorizing, stereotyping, and labeling the children. They had a class A, B, C, and the children were very aware of being labeled in class B, and actually Judge Raymond Uno, who became the first Asian American judge in Utah, was labeled in the class B, as well as Jeanette Misaka, who's a PhD from University of Utah professor. So they were very successful. I mean, it turned out my parents were labeled AA, and I kept on hearing it after my mother died from the other Nisei, how it kind of bothered them, but your parents were in the class A and we were class B, and I go, it's not my fault, I wasn't there. But it kind of had a psychological scar, I think, on their lives, and they were only children. They were just, you know, innocent children. The other thing I thought,
what did the classes mean exactly?
basically it was sort of labeling their scholastic ability and their social adaptability. They analyzed my mother, the way she was dressed, the way she was groomed, the way she appeared, the way she interacted with people. And, you know, this was in many ways part of a larger assimilation plan. You know, they really wanted the Japanese Americans to become Americans. So I think they were sorting out the kids the way that the camp sorted out incarcerees by sending some to Tule Lake, right? So this weaning and this dividing and this labeling had happened all throughout the incarceration. And the last bit of information that I thought was really interesting, that was very self-revealing, is in my mother's file, not only did she spend 14 days in a hospital getting her appendix removed when she was a child, which must have been horrible to be separated from your family, because that camp was huge, as you'll see tomorrow. You know, she literally, you know, miles and miles apart were these barracks in the hospital. And in the top of her file, the name Shirley was written in the corner by the teacher. And so essentially, part of that Americanization process was giving my mother Setsuko an American name, Shirley, which she then ended up passing on to me. And she reclaimed her name Setsuko into her adulthood after the war, but she gave that name to me, which kind of irritated me a little bit, but because I don't even like the name Shirley. But so that was the most unique revelation for me.
It's always easier to write a book when people are still alive, having done it both ways. And so truly my greatest primary source were the people I talked to in person. But I do want to, with what Shirley's brought up, you know, when you run into these things you're just not expecting. I remember when I first read about the children's village at Manzanar, because do you know this story? Do you know that they came through, the officials in California, came through all the orphanages, foster care homes, and adoptive homes looking for children who had 1/8 or more Japanese blood. And even if they were in adoptive families, in orphanages, in care centers, they took these children. from their families and their caregivers and took them to Manzanar. And they had a whole section there called the Children's Village. And I'm an adoptive parent. I mean, I think of that sometimes with the trauma heaped on top of trauma. And there were care workers with one of the care centers where these children were. I'm sure it was an orphanage, who were so concerned about those children being taken that they went with them and stayed with them during the war there. Anyway, certainly Norm and Alan Simpson were my very best sources. I debated about bringing Alan's voice into the story because the rest of the book is all told through Norm and his memories. And you know, when you're working with somebody with something that's happened all those years back, Norm, you've heard a lot of his stories, but there are so many more that we just had to work to uncover. It's sort of like peeling back layers on an onion to really get back what was it like that particular day when that happened, and trying to reconstruct some dialogue. And so, you know, there are a lot of things he just hadn't thought about or hasn't been asked about that come out in this story for me, trying to get the most complete experience possible for young readers when they're reading this, so that they really become Norm. What it was like when he was being taunted in school after Pearl Harbor, and you know, with kids using Jap as a dirty word and saying, "You bombed Pearl Harbor," you know, things like that. With Alan, I decided to go with it. I decided to see if I could maybe do one chapter from his perspective and tell from his point of view, meeting Norm in the camp. And I got some real gems from him. He's been interviewed, and they both have been on this experience many times, but there I was digging it for a lot of things that, you know, wanting to know about Alan's family, wanting to know his father was the civil defense officer for the county, so there were all these blackout drills, and Alan had this target, you know, and they'd put the name Hitler on it, for example, and he and his brother would shoot it with BB guns. I mean, just all these different kinds of things. But then there were some stories that were sort of contradicting Norm's stories, so then we had to try to get some of that straightened around and go with what we could. And so it's not always what you've heard in other stories, but it's the stories they were giving me. So always the people are the primary sources. Dakota was wonderful when I would call him and I'd say, "I've hit a dead end. I've found 3 different sources. They all say something different about this or that," and then he would do some research here and get back to me. I mean, it was just invaluable. It's such a community of generous people. It's been a real pleasure being involved with it.
First, I'll second Shirley and Andy and just say that, you know, first-person interviews are invaluable when it comes to stuff like this. So I've been lucky to be able to interview one living player, Kichi Ikeda, and then interviews with the Nomura and Yoshinaga Agawa family and Okomachis. So whether it's living spouses or their children, being able to go through family memories. The Horse Yoshinaga had just a huge trove of things from during the war and after the war that his children have kept that I've been able to go through, and the same with Babe Nomura. For me, writing about teenagers, though, what's been really helpful is reading the Heart Mountain High School newspaper. So you learn what these kids are doing outside of their everyday life. So whether that's, you know, sports, dances, different fundraisers, you get a real sense of what 15 to 18-year-olds value, even though they're in a concentration camp. So you sort of see this spirit that has been created there, which I have really enjoyed, because, you know, we've all been 15 to 18 years old, and we understand what those years are like. We understand what those years are like when we're in high school in New York or Maryland or California, but seeing what these kids experienced and how they sort of, what lens they saw their experience through in a high school newspaper has been really helpful to me in coloring what experience it was for this football team. And at the same time, all of these young men on the football team were having to decide whether they wanted to resist the draft. So you have lots of different things that were kind of pulling boys from 17, 18, 19 years old in a lot of different directions, that it has been really helpful to see what the perspective is from a high school newspaper. So,
excuse me.
yeah.
Was this the Cody High School that
No,
they were
no,
bused
no,
to?
no,
Or
no.
they had their own
Yeah,
separate...
Heart Mountain High School had its own.
Wow.
Heart Mountain had its own high school. It was, you know, at first it was just in a barrack, but then they eventually built a high school, and it you know, by the end they had a gymnasium. At the beginning it was a disaster, but by the end they actually made a nice, fairly nice gym, and they had a high school newspaper, which has, again, it's been totally invaluable when you're trying to learn about 17-year-olds from 70 years ago. So.
So in terms of sources for my book and the research, I try to find a good balance between kind of telling the story from the outside in and from the inside out. So I did have a lot of showing that, you know, WRA and FBI records and government perspectives from the outside in, but from the inside out, I was able to do about, one of the only good things about this book having taken 17 plus years was I interviewed people when they were in their, you know, the other day I met somebody who was 96 years old at one of my book talks. And he was like, "You interviewed me when I was 84 years old. And you took so long to finish the book." But anyway, but you know, I was able to interview people like 120 oral histories, and then but I think the primary source that really struck me as like the differentiator for this book was Japanese language diaries, because the thing about when you triangulate your sources from the government point of view, from oral histories, when people are trying to remember things that happened a long time ago, sometimes they don't remember things quite, you know, but if you check their diary that's contemporaneous, you can kind of triangulate the data to kind of figure out what the real story was, as, you know, far as you can. And so the two diaries that really helped me with my book, one was this family gave me this 1,600 page in Japanese diary of their father's journey through the various Department of Justice camps. And, you know, so it was just a lot of, I ended up trying about half of it for the family, but there's these little gems in there. For example, I don't know how many people here know about the Tuna Canyon Detention Center. It's one of the places that were really temporary before people went on to the big justice camps. But at that time, like, very few contemporaneous accounts, because they were only there for like a week, 10 days, 13 days. And so this particular diary had 13 days of thick description about what was happening at that particular place. So that kind of gem sometimes exists in these diaries. And then the other thing is that that diary I translated was one related to, it's been in the news recently, Fort Sill, Oklahoma, a place that was a really short internment camp for the Japanese. April to May of 1942, 700 Japanese immigrant men there, 90 of them were Buddhist priests. And so one of the Buddhist priest diaries talks about the heat there. It talks about how they weren't able to get soap, how they weren't able to get toothpaste, how the wind was so strong their tents fell over in the heat, and it just reminded, I think, a lot of people about that announcement last month that from the Trump administration that they're going to send 1,400 Central American migrant children separated from their families from some of these border detention places to Fort Sill. And this little gem of this diary by a Buddhist priest about what life was like back then in World War II and what these children might face today, I was like, oh, that's why it's worth translating some of these diaries, because it gives the perspective of, you know, they left it in Japanese. These were Issei men, community leaders, and they have, you know, their children, their teenagers, but these are like people in their prime, you know, late 40s, 50s, 60s, 70, 80-year-old. So they're older adults, and I feel like that perspective has been a little bit missing in some of our discussions about World War II incarceration. And so, you know, I feel like there's a lot more work we can do on these type of first-person account diaries that's contemporaneous, that's written from that little bit older generation.
Thanks. As an aside, the high school gymnasium that Brad mentioned, I believe was taken after the war and shipped to a town east of here, Wyoming, where it's now part of the high school.
I mean, it was, I know that there were not demonstrations, but the people of Cody, Pell, and the surrounding towns were upset by how nice the facility was when they built the high school.
Right.
Yeah.
And that was kind of a recurring theme throughout that whole experience. And even today, I've talked to people, homesteaders and descendants of homesteaders, who feel like people who were incarcerated here somehow got a better deal than the people who have lived here since then.
Can I add one thing about that? I think if my research is correct, though, it wasn't the government who built the high school. It was the state of Wyoming, and they just simply did it to the same scale that they were doing all of their high schools in the state. So here you've got the third largest town in Wyoming now, so it warranted a brick high school with a gymnasium and a football field and so forth. Sorry. So it was a very nice facility, given what it was, but then people in the area got so upset about it because it was so nice that they were planning to build great schools, and they backed off on it and just kept those in the barracks.
Another question related to documents and the putting together of a book. Can each of you describe one thing that you either had to leave out of your book or are leaving out of your book, or something that you thought you were going to use and then turned out not to be true?
Let Duncan go first.
You didn't use all 121.
Yeah, so I couldn't use everything. And about 4 years ago, I had a version of the manuscript that was about 700 pages. And Harvard University Press, which is my publisher, told me, like, we want you to write a book that has a crossover possibility, that's not going to be just read by people who are already interested in the subject. We want you to write it in that way, and so we have two pieces of like advice for you. One, you have to cut this thing in half, and two, they were like Yamaguchi, Yamamoto, Yamanishi. They were like, there's too many Japanese names that we can't keep track. Can you get it down to 7 main characters? And I was like, I'm not really writing a novel, And for me, it was like really important to name names, because these are people written out of history. Even like Japanese Americans, somehow the Buddhist part of the story is like been written out. So I was like, no, so the compromise we came up with was, if you ever, my book, it's out there, it has a very large endnote section. That's where I preserve people's names. So the names are in there. It's just that I couldn't get it down to 7 characters, but there are certain people that kind of drive the story of the book. And so that kind of compromise of trying to deal with the publisher about what to leave in, what to leave out, I hope I did justice to that.
Well, you just answered the question for myself, actually. I think it's really hard to write these books. It's very difficult. In some ways, if you're focused on one character, and I'd be interested in getting Andy's perspective on how it was for you to be able to concentrate on one character. In some ways, I would think it would be a little easier, but I ran into the problem, and this came from the publisher as well, that here I have 8 or 10 families, and again, a lot of Japanese names. And some of them actually had similar names, which made it difficult. But you sort of start out where my grandparents were, and then where Norm's grandparents were, even what Al Simpson's parents were doing at the moment, and essentially becomes very, very jumbled. So what we had to really do was sort of pare down the material and sort of focus most squarely on the issues that would have been of interest to the reader. And we're still actually working through that process. But I think that the hardest part of writing a book that I'm challenged with is it's hard to write a memoir in some ways with meaning, with a very clear and accurate historical account, because folks are not around, and you have to take some authorship and some privilege to sort of read into what you've experienced as a child growing up with former incarcerees and my grandparents. So I think what's really hard was to try to know the right amount of sort of emotional information to contain in the book. And part of the area that I did explore was something that I've coined the Sansei effect, and we'll be exploring this more at the JCL conference next weekend, where many of us really believe that what our parents experienced and our grandparents experienced has had a multi-generational impact to my generation, and it's really going into some of the things that feel uncomfortable that I experienced as a child, because nobody was a bad person in this situation. But as a child, when you experience, for instance, a certain level of control of your life that your mother wants to place on you, and certain standards, you'll go to the best schools, you'll marry this man, you'll do this and do that. It's hard to express the concern that one has as a child now that I'm an adult. How do you explain with that experience without dishonoring your family and without, appearing negative? So I think I struggled with how much to leave in and how much to leave out in that, and I hope I can actually strike that right balance and do justice to my family and community.
With the kind of books that I write, because they are history, and I'm a historian, I want to write history. And this is where I have to make tons of compromises. For example, when I started reading about Eleanor Roosevelt and how she stood up for the Japanese Americans, how she not only visited one of the camps, Gila River, I had her picture in the paper with Japanese Americans, how she wrote in her column that these are our friends and our neighbors, and she stood up for German Americans and Italian Americans too. And the FBI had a huge dossier on her. They had her followed. I mean, if she hadn't been the president's wife, she would have been in big trouble, I think. But the book isn't about Eleanor Roosevelt, so it's so hard because you want to go off on these things. When you start looking at what our government was doing in terms of how it started isolating the Japanese Americans, I mean, it's sometimes I've said it's like right out of the Hitler playbook. Was there somebody who wrote this manual somewhere in history, and then these people took it and they said, okay, you get a registry, you freeze their bank accounts, you take away their business licenses, a curfew, all the things that were done to the Jews in Germany were done to the Japanese Americans here in the United States. And so it's just so difficult to keep it reined in and keep it tight. And I'm telling the story of one person, and so I do want to focus on what was happening to Norm and his family, but it wasn't always the same thing that was happening to others. His family was very fortunate in some ways because they had somebody to rent the house while they were gone, so they had income coming in that whole time. I mean, they were very, his father was such a well-known person, he wasn't arrested there at the beginning, and others had to deal that whole war with this one person who was off in some prison somewhere and they didn't even know where. So just this was the constant challenge for me, was to keep the story where my readers would just keep going through it, so it reads almost like a novel. I've always had, I think with every publisher I've had several, they'll say, well, let's do sidebars. And I said, no, because it's not a textbook. We're not doing sidebars. And I've just always said, it's not going to read like that. It's narrative nonfiction. So there are sections in the back where I do pick up some of these other things that I just didn't feel I could put in the story, but felt so important that I had to get them down on paper for people, for kids.
I think the idea of characters was really important to me at the beginning too, because when I'm not ethnically Japanese in any way, and when I was reading a lot of history books that were written by other white people, frankly, none of them had characters. They all were just this kind of jumble of history about this experience and this. And frankly, I got to the end of all of them and was really bored. Like, there's lots of good information in there, and I'm glad that these books exist, but you don't learn who these people are. You don't learn who the people are that were really in the camps, that were the books that were written by other white people. So for me, really early on, it was trying to figure out who the characters are that could help me pull this story through in a few different ways. So I start with a few characters, 2 at the beginning, and then when we get to the camp, we introduce more people as they sort of meet. But for me, it was trying to figure out, what information do I have? How do I best present it at the beginning so that people start to care about these characters as people first, not as people that are going to end up in a prison camp. So you want to learn about them as high schoolers, you want to learn about them as children, you want to learn about what their family life was like. At the same time, that does mean that when you're going through the WRA files, you see stuff that ethically you have to think about and pause on as to whether to use. Like Shirley was talking about, these sort of psychological profiles that all of these teenagers go through. You get to see all their health records. You get to see stuff that none of us would want people knowing about us from when we were 16 years old. So for me as a journalist, it's hard because you get all of this tons and tons and tons of information, and your thought is to just, you want to include all of this because you want to build these huge, well-rounded characters, but at the same time you have to sort of put up this ethical wall sometimes and say, is this serving this person's legacy, or is this just serving my book? And that for me has taken a lot of trying to figure out from a soul-searching standpoint what to leave out and what to put in, while not sort of forsaking who I think I am as a professional, but also giving respect to these people who mostly are dead. Yeah.
Did you, you said most of these people are dead. Did
Yeah.
you ever speak to those people who were still alive as to whether you wanted them to include something or not?
Yeah, so whenever I do an interview with someone that's still alive, I go through, it's going to be on the record, this is what we're talking about, this is, now that you and I are talking, this is stuff that I can use. So people know sort of up front that this is what I'm going to be going through. When it's people that are dead and I'm looking at their files at the National Archives in DC, if I haven't been in contact with their family, or if I have been in contact with their family, it adds a different layer as to whether I'm going to use a certain file. And there's some things, in these files, some of them are 3 pages long and some of them are 400 pages long. And some, depending on how active they were and whether they had somebody at the camp from the FBI watching them, or if they were just a teenager. So you have lots of different things, but literally, you have every single time they went to visit a doctor, for a hangnail all the way up to things that no one wants to know you went to a doctor for. So,
would you go a step further and interview the living relatives then for those people that were?
I've interviewed family members from 5 different players that have passed away. So,
Okay, got it.
yeah.
I just have a really quick question for Brad. And again, this is just an impression when I heard about the stadium being built and all that. And I don't even know how to ask this question in a way that really makes a lot of sense. But, it seems like a lot of things were based sort of on commodity, based on kind of, tied to money, tied to sort of what should be happening at the time. And do you think the emphasis on football and building that stadium and getting the Japanese American young men to compete against the local Wyoming teams was some way and a way to another form of propaganda in some sense? Or why did they want that competition? And what were they thinking they were going to beat the Japanese American kids? Or I guess I'm just sort of confused.
So they had a basketball court, but they didn't have a football stadium. So they just had a field, and everyone would just stand around the field.
Okay.
But football, especially, I think was a way, because you could just do it in a field. You didn't have to have a basketball hoop or much additional equipment. And when the camp first opened that fall, they had 6-on-6 leagues. So they had kids that were playing, they had adults that were playing, and then it just kind of snowballed from there. There were only 3 players on the team that first year that ever played football before outside of the camp. So basically they took a lot of teenagers who were frankly pretty bored and basically said, this is going to be our fall sport, and they knew that there were still Wyoming teams that had football teams. Wyoming is football is pretty popular in Wyoming for exactly the same reasons. You have a field, you have football. Yes, you need pads and things, but you don't need a hoop. You don't need a nice hardwood floor. And the first basketball season, when players like Dave Namora played basketball, a lot of the football players were on the basketball team that first season. They practiced outside on the dirt and then would go to Warland or Cody or Powell and play indoors. So you have these, to get back to your original question, I don't think that there's a sort of a propaganda angle to it, more so than just how can we give these very active teenage boys something to do so they don't get in trouble. Here's football now, we're going to do baseball in the spring, we're going to do basketball in the winter. I might be misreading it, but that's how I've sort of interpreted it wasn't a huge financial burden for the camp. That, I mean, they wore old pennies. They basically had cardboard stuffed into their pants. So it wasn't exactly financially. They just had the gym teacher coach the football team. So it wasn't much to say, let's do this, so that they aren't just walking around the streets every afternoon.
It was interesting hearing Duncan describe his experience with his publisher, saying how many Japanese names he had, because that sounded like the exact conversation that Shirley had with her publisher. In fact, we said, but Duncan Williams has a lot of Japanese names. And it didn't seem to work. I'm going to ask one more question of the panel, and then I'm going to take it to your questions. Is there anything from working on this book that has inspired you to work on another project? And I'll start with Andy.
No.
This has hit me at sort of an odd time in my career, because I keep saying I'm going to take time off now. I'm giving myself an unpaid leave to do some other things. But there's no question it's gone in at a cellular level. And I don't know where it's coming out. It will. It will, because when I run up against a story, I just can't resist that I'm going to do something with it. It may not be a book. It may end up in a children's magazine. I'm part of a nonfiction children's authors group that we sponsor what's called the nonfictionminute.org, which is free for educators, and we write these 400-word pieces. I'm planning one now on internment, but I suspect that I'll have, by the time I'm done, 3 or 4 of them that will have something to do with this topic. I can't resist it. It's been a very life-affirming project for me to work on. It's been a very humbling one. Again, I've written stories about the Civil War, about the Vietnam War, about the Holocaust, all for children, and so I've spent a lot of time in this kind of territory about how you bring these stories to life for a young audience in such a way that they really get it. They become the character, they live the story, and they don't forget the story that they've gone through, and it very well could turn up in something else. And you heard me ask my question this morning about looking for comments about what's happening in our southern border, and who knows, it may end up with something that's going on there. I wish I had a more definitive answer. I don't at the moment.
What was that website again?
It's called the nonfictionminute.org. These are all 400-word pieces.
Yeah, speaking to Andy, and I know that Duncan and Shirley have done the same thing, I think what this book has done for me, especially right now in like our political moment, is it's sort of, because we all have this information that is unfortunately relevant to right now. So I find myself much more politically active and in educating even just people, not necessarily. I know that Shirley and Duncan have done a lot of work with op-eds and at Fort Sill, which is just fantastic. But what I've learned, what I take away mostly from my research now, is pushing myself forward and pushing our country forward to make sure that these sort of things, they are happening again right now. And the idea that we say never again, it's already happened. So I think my next step forward probably isn't another book about this. It's figuring out these other stories of other people that have had these situations that might unfortunately pop up again in our lives here in America, and figuring out ways to tell those stories to educate folks on that. So.
Thank you. I have a suggestion for Andy, and they're right next door. What about a children's book about the 93 resistors? And Tako Shizaki is still alive to tell that story, and he's currently on my board. It's just something to think about. Well, one of the projects, the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation actually has just formed an institute where we're exploring a variety of different outlets in media, literary publications, etc. And Ray and I are working on a couple of projects with the staff where we're focusing on a republication of original works. And with that republication of the original work, what we then will do is an epilogue that really expands beyond that original story. One of them that we're working on is Lone Heart Mountain, which is the story of Estelle Ishigo, a Caucasian woman who was married to a Japanese American man and followed him into camp, gave up her life to be with him. And we had a lot of activity since then with this public auction of her artwork that we were able to halt through Heart Mountain's work with an injunction and working with JANM and the Not For Sale website. So we really want to give that epilogue and give it a more modern update in terms of what exists. Another book that we're working on as a republication is Lone Heart, One Light, One Candle, which is a story of Clarence Matsumura. The niece is actually on my board, Ora Matsumura. And it's a story that's already been published, but it's out of print. And it's a story of Clarence coming of age, going overseas to fight as a Japanese-American soldier in the U.S. Army and liberating Dachau and actually saving the life of Sali Ganor, a Jewish Lithuanian Jew who was incarcerated during the Holocaust. And we wanted to do an epilogue, essentially, of that book because of, well, the fact that his great niece, Ora Newland, is on our board and what we've done to honor him and honor Sali since that time. Actually, my daughter, who's in the audience, Adele, if you want to raise your hand, will be delivering a scroll to Sali Ganor in August. She's going to Israel and she'll meet with him in Tel Aviv and honor him by handing a scroll signed by of appreciation from our board members. So that's what we'll be up to.
You know, I try to write a book that could stand the test of time, and so...
So you're done.
When the publisher said, please don't have a forward afterward that references Trump, because that will date it in a certain kind of way. Leave that up to what, you know, you go on your book tour, start writing op-eds. So that's why I've written, you know, I've been invited to write op-eds at Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, mainly about that kind of the new angle on the book, which is that it's not just race but religion. John DeWitt, in his final report 43, specifically says when giving the rationale for why the mass incarceration was necessary, why the forced removal was necessary, he says it's because of the ties of this, he calls it a menace, this community, with the enemy nation through strong ties of race, culture, and religion. And so, to me, that's the enduring question in American life, American bullying. Who is included, who is excluded? So a lot of my work now is about, like, Trump travel ban and Muslim, you know, like what is America in terms of religion, but also race, right? Southern border. And so last weekend I was at Fort Sill and organized a group of, in my other life I'm a Buddhist priest, so I had robes on, and we had 25 Buddhist priests, you know, with their robes at Fort Sill, making that point about this is something that happened back then, and it's wrong then, it's wrong now. And so I think that's been surprising new work for me, because I'm not used to being, you know, getting ready to be civil disobedience or arrested or something with other Buddhist priests. We know how to chant. and working with like young Latinx dreamers and like the American Indian movement, spiritually, I co-led a ritual with him, and so that kind of coalition building is something that it seems like that's one way to kind of keep this project going, but in a very different, timely way.
Actually, can I add something quick to that? Like Duncan had said about the forward or afterward about Trump, is that when I was meeting with publishers, one of the publishers asked, like, you know, how will you include Donald Trump in this book? And I was like, he's not going to be in the book. And my agent and I walked out of the meeting and we were like, we don't want to work with that editor, because all of these stories are stories, like you said, Duncan, that should stand the test of time. So if somebody picks this up in 40 years, they don't want to read a chapter about how we connected to this 18 months in American history. We want something that stands the test of time and teaches people lessons from this moment, whether it's in 2019, 2020, or 2050. So I think, for me, that was really important too, just to sort of say, no, like, this story stands itself as a reminder, we don't need to drag the present into it.
That's a good point.
Yeah, you can use what's happening now to market your book.
Right.
And say, hey, this is why this is still relevant, but it doesn't actually need to be in the book.
Yeah.
Because as you mentioned, he wasn't around.
Yeah.
It's not about him. That's the last question that I have for you. Kick it open to you guys for any questions you may have of the authors. And
There are a couple.
yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering how you would recommend if you wanted to get more Reunification Authority files on your family. What do you do?
Oh, you could actually go to the National Archives, and there's a process. Julie Abo, and actually Ray, you're probably aware of it too, but actually did a lot of the file pulling for me. So if you're interested, I can connect you with Julie, and she can explain that. Helen Yoshida also helped with the research for my book.
It's surprisingly easy.
Easy, yeah.
Like if you sit there, basically all you need to do is go in, have an obituary or a death record of someone who has died, or if you are an incarcerate, you're welcome to your own file. And you basically just walk in that morning at the National Archives when it opens, you register, and then you get there first thing, you put your slip in, and then usually by about 10 or 11 a.m. you
So you
have
have
the
to go
file.
there.
Yeah, you do have to go there. And they're not, some NARA files for this time period are digitized, but none of those evacuee files are.
But I'm based in DC with Julie, and Julie might be able to
Yeah.
help you and have some, assign an intern to go or something.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Right, any other there's a question back here.
Yeah.
That's a question and just a comment. So I'm mid-50s and I'm born, raised in Wyoming, educated in Wyoming. So that would be grade school, middle school, and high school. And so the first that I ever learned of the Japanese internment camp in my state was in college. So prior to that, I had been educated in Wyoming history in grade school. And I have no recollection of any mentioning of this happening in our state. And then I had a section in high school, of course, on Wyoming history, and there was no mention that I can remember of this happening in my state. And in college, which is the University of Wyoming, I had nothing that was given to me as a mention of what happened in my state. So I learned of it just by happenstance by doing an English project, or for whatever reasons I came across a book that described the Japanese internment camp at Hart Mountain. So fast forward 30 years and I'm a school board member, and I happened to come to PAL to work and come to the interpretive center and was just so impressed with what was offered and thought it was just a fantastic thing to give back to Wyoming students, and as a school board member thought that it was quite relevant that it was so close to my home school district. In approaching history teachers in my district, in the school board itself, there was absolutely no interest in coming to the Hart Mountain Interpretive Center. So the point is really much to what was listed this morning, which is history doesn't repeat itself, but it tends to rhyme. And I think the step for that has to be ignorance. In my state, I believe we want to believe as cowboys in exceptionalism. And we're happy to own that part of our existence, but not ones to take on the harm that's embedded in our history. And so I believe that it's intentional yet today at an organizational level that we refuse to acknowledge this, and thereby I still see my state as one of extreme racism and homophobia. And so, thank you, because I think the way that perhaps things go around the system is through stories, through things like this, curriculum, I'm hoping, but by the same token, you should know that even somebody that has quite an education was quite ignorant to this, and I believe, having 3 daughters, they are too. So, just know that in our state, this is the way I see it, as a fairly informed man.
So when I first started researching my book, I was just like you. I knew nothing about this, and I think that at first I was, upset that I hadn't learned about this. And I started thinking about it more. And World War II was such an easy thing when you're teaching it to teach as black and white. America was good; these people were bad. But I think that when we really learn about history is in that gray area, like what our country does, any country does in those moments where it's not black and white. And how do we see our country in those moments? How do we challenge our country to do better in those moments? And that's how I view my book and how I view the work that I'm doing, is trying to shine some light on that gray area that was awful for hundreds of thousands of people that lived here. And sort of showing what went into that so that we can see the mistakes of the past. So that's just how I've kind of looked at education of it.
What I would add to that is if you take a look at American history textbooks, starting in upper elementary and on through mid school and high school, and you look at where they were 40 years ago and you look at where they are today, they really are changing. The stories of minorities, of women, are in there and getting to be in there more and more. And we see the changes, I think, coming through the film industry too, about whose stories are going to be told and from what perspective. A musical like Hamilton with its mixed cast, but all of these things, there really is some change afoot. I identify completely with what you said about the state of Wyoming, and I think probably we all have pretty much the same story here. We didn't learn this in school. So we're dropping our pebbles in the pond here, and others are doing it too, and it's happening. But we really need to open our eyes to this. We can create a different future.
Well, also, Deborah and Diane talked about their curriculum project. I'm wondering whether that could be something we could end with in terms of what you have available for education about non-story.
Sure. Thank you, Shirley. First, thank you very much to the panel. Very enlightening and enlightened discussion. Thank you all for sharing. I'm Deborah Nakatomi. I'm the co-producer of the film you saw this morning, and we just kind of gave a little bit of a brief tease, but as part of the film, we've developed a separate curriculum project targeting high school and college students, and it was our belief that Norm's life, his career, really do exemplify a number of really important themes that we're all talking about today. There's a card that describes the themes and how we're approaching them, but we're working with Stanford University, and they're just about completed. And there'll be teacher materials, very specific teacher modules. There'll be content directed to students. It's free, it's online, it's downloadable, it will be available on an iPhone, on a personal device. And we're hoping that through Norm's story, as well as a lot of other interviews that we did, you saw some snippets of them. We interviewed a lot of young people, and we brought the larger kind of social, political, current dialogue into the curriculum. So that will be available, and there's information on where you can go to sign up. There are many teachers here that I'm realizing, or recently retired educators, and people who just care deeply about this. So we really urge you to take advantage of the curriculum. It will be available probably in October. Okay, thank you, Shirley.
Well, that should do it for this panel. We have a bunch of other ones coming up in the next few minutes. Thanks for coming, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.